Hello, folks, and welcome to week 4 of American Literature 2. This week, we're going to be thinking about the Harlem Renaissance. And so, this is a video lecture that covers this entire week. It's going to be a little bit on the longer side as far as our semester's lectures go, just because this is very much my wheelhouse as a scholar. So, I have the most that I could say about it, but I'm going to really distill down to the essential stuff that you need just for this American literature survey course. If this was a course specifically in African American literature, we would, of course, spend 2 to 3 weeks on this unit and a lot more information. But you're just going to get the kind of surface level, like intro, super intro stuff. So here we go. Okay, so the Harlem Renaissance is a full African American cultural renaissance. And what I mean by a cultural renaissance is uh, following the American Civil War that ends in 1865, and following the period that's called Reconstruction, which is one of the most potentially radically um, uh, liberatory historical moments in U.S. history, where uh, there are attempts to um, really change U.S. society to allow for a true racial egalitarianism. Reconstruction is completely uh, cut off and hit with a massive racist backlash at the end of the 1880s. And so a period of time happens in African American history that some African American historians call the nadir of Black history, where following the promises of Reconstruction, um, a wave of violent racism and fascist legislation creates an explicit second class citizenship status for African Americans. Um, However, so this period lasts for a few decades, and at the beginning of the 20th century, some folks date it around between 1915 and 1918. There starts to be this cultural renaissance amongst African Americans that um, that that aligns with a movement called the Great Migration. I'm hitting these bullet points a little bit out of order, but the Great Migration is one of the largest mass movements of people within the United States in U.S. history, and millions of Black people move from the South to cities in the North and West. Um, and so, aligning with this migration, aligning with this kind of Black people in the United States explicitly trying to resist the uh, the violences of what is called the nadir. These violences being things like lynching, like the Ku Klux Klan, laws that prevent Black people from voting, right? Um, and so African Americans start to form uh, communities and literary societies, artistic societies, intellectual societies, and start to collectively produce this idea of what gets called the quote unquote new Negro. Now, throughout this lecture and throughout this week, we're going to hear some antiquated terms for Black people in the United States. And during this unit, I'm going to say Black or African American, but when reading or referring to texts from the time that use the phrase Negro, I am going to say that term out loud because it's very important for you to know that Negro, while now it would be racist for you to call a Black person a Negro, don't do that. Um, at the time, Negro is actually the self-preferred word that Black people in the United States used for themselves, right? They were like, this is before the term African American becomes the kind of universal preference. So the articulated term of the Harlem Renaissance of what folks were collectively arguing for was the emergence of a new Negro. So you'll hear me say that phrase, and we might say that phrase if we're reading it from a text. However, when we see the N word, and I know you all know what word I'm talking about, When you see the N word in text, no one in class who is not black is allowed to say that word, right? I will not tell a black person whether they can or can't use the N word. However, if you're not black, meaning that word has never been used as a way specifically to racially attack you, you can't use that word in our class, and I won't either. It actually will appear in the reading for this week. So if you're reading out loud the reading for this week in class in Zoom, um, you can just say N word, and not say the whole word. But Negro is different. Negro is a self um, preferred term from the early 20th century that Black people used. And so there's this idea, collective theorization, if you will, through literature, through cultural production, through art, um, uh, through journalism, of creating a new Negro post Nadir. And so the center, the geographic center of this movement is Harlem, New York, right? You've probably, even though this is New Mexico, I'm sure because of the kind of cultural prominence of New York City, you've at least heard of Harlem before, as a predominantly Black neighborhood in New York City. And so a whole bunch of Black artists and writers are moving through the cities of the North and the West. And Harlem becomes a central, vibrant site of Black cultural leaders, mixing and exchanging ideas and debating and arguing and partying and just like thinking and producing new ways of doing art. Um, uh, However, while the term Harlem Renaissance is super local to one specific neighborhood in one city, it is also important for me to note, and this could be its own whole lecture, that the Harlem Renaissance is actually a global phenomenon where even as there is such a predominant site of cultural exchange happening in Harlem, New York, um, the city of Chicago is just as important. The city of Philadelphia is just as important. New Orleans is just as important. The Caribbean, the entire Caribbean, is just as important. Jamaica is part of the story of the Harlem Renaissance. Haiti is part of the story of the Harlem Renaissance. Um, and so I want you to understand, and I'm not going to talk at length about this, but just understand that this is also a period where Black people in the United States are really theorizing out what it means to be a diaspora people and to think about what it means to be African people in America, right? What does that mean as people who have roots on the African continent? And so a lot of the Harlem Renaissance art and literature is thinking about the kind of cultural inheritances from um, various dozens of different African cultures, right? And so the Harlem Renaissance, while it's hyper local in its nomenclature, is actually a period of global awareness of global Black cultural traditions and diasporic traditions. And it has as much, and while this is an English class, and so we're going to be talking about literature in our class, I need to like signal that this is also a period that is just as much about music and visual art and sculptural art and philosophy and photography, as much about all these other forms of art as it is about literature. The Harlem Renaissance is not just a literary movement. It is as much, if not even more, about music and visual art, right? Um, W.E.B. Du Bois, who I'll talk about in a few moments, um, begins the 20th century by theorizing this term called double consciousness in a really famous book called The Souls of Black Folk. And double consciousness is the idea that Black people um, in the United States have to have a kind of second sight where they see themselves from their own point of view, but they also are always conscious of themselves from the white point of view, always being conscious of how they are viewed by the white gaze, even as they are also conscious of how they see themselves, the world themselves. And so Du Bois theorizes this idea of double consciousness, of always actually having two sights and two consciousnesses. And that core idea influences the entire Harlem Renaissance, even for folks who aren't using that term. And the last bullet point on here is the Harlem Renaissance was just as queer as it was Black. That's a slight revision from a quote by a scholar named Henry Louis Gates. just as a way to signal that so many of the most prominent Harlem Renaissance figures were themselves queer, including Langston Hughes, Alan Locke, Angelina Wells Grimke, who we're reading in this class, um, and so many others. Chauncey Cullen, Claude McKay, um, so many Harlem Renaissance prominent figures are themselves queer. And in Harlem, New York, you have the roots of what becomes like ball culture and queer culture in later decades of U.S. history. You have the kind of gender, like a lot of gender expression experimentation. And so the Harlem Renaissance winds up being this moment not of just racial consciousness, but of experimentations in gender and sexuality that are very queer. Okay, so some context for the Harlem Renaissance that is important for you to think about and know about, especially as we read Angelina Wells Grimke's play Rachel this week. Um, Lynching and Jim Crow. So first, Jim Crow, it was a system of legal segregation and juridical second-class citizenship for African Americans. And what I mean by that, why I'm emphasizing legal and juridical, is that Jim Crow was not just like the level of like cultural prejudice, where like some people, like white people, didn't like black people and were racist against them. It's important to understand that that Jim Crow was a legal system, that there were actual laws in the books called, for example, the Black Codes in most southern states that explicitly punished Black people for crimes that white people weren't punished for. Um, Jim Crow was the signature legislation of Jim Crow was, of course, voting laws, laws that instilled polling taxes or literacy tests that you had to pass in order to vote. But of course, if your father or grandfather voted before you didn't have to pass the test. White, illiterate white people whose parents had voted before, even though they couldn't pass the literacy test, the laws didn't affect them because their families had always been able to vote because white people had been able to vote. And so if you ever hear the phrase grandfathered in, that phrase actually comes from the really racist history of allowing white people to do things that black people weren't allowed to do. Um, and so I wrote in this bullet point, in short, American fascism. And so I think in a moment where a lot of people are thinking about like fascist politics and fascism, and we often think about that as a history that comes from Europe, I think it's really important for us to understand that in a US context, Jim Crow itself, because it specifically designated a racial group of people, black people specifically, and deliberately, and made them into second class citizens that literally did not have the same rights as other people. Um, and actually controlled who could and could not vote, and which in a way like actually prevented democracy. The United States itself has a history of fascism, and I'm emphasizing that because I think it's important to understand. Talking about the Harlem Renaissance and the great literature and art that's produced, the great, amazing, beautiful literature and art that is produced in the Harlem Renaissance is literature and art that is produced by a people living under fascism. And that is, and I say that without exaggeration. And then the second thing to know about is lynching, which is, of course, an extra legal practice of often ritual killing in the US. It usually refers to hanging. Um, and it's important to know, especially because we live in New Mexico, that lynching is something that affected also indigenous and Hispanic and Asian people in the American West, west of the Mississippi. Um, uh, Lynching predominantly affected African Americans east of the Mississippi. Um, and it was a practice that basically involved white people grabbing a black person of any gender, women as well as men were lynched, and hanging them to death publicly, like very publicly and very unashamedly. You've probably heard of the Ku Klux Klan, which is, of course, a domestic terrorist organization that wear the white costumes and the white masks and hoods and horses, and the myth is that the KKK kind of was the lynching organization in the United States. And while the KKK was a terrible, murderous terrorist organization, most lynchings in the United States were actually committed by regular U.S. citizens not wearing KKK garb. In fact, there's an entire genre of something called lynching photography, where white people took photographs of lynchings, and proudly, like you could see their faces. They're not covering their faces. They're often wearing their kind of like Sunday best. They're like middle class clothing. Um, so lynching was not a thing that just like a like crazy subsection of like extremist people in the United States did. Lynching was actually a form of extra legal ritual murder that was practiced by like regular, everyday, middle class white Americans. Right? It was like a regular thing that regular people did. And again, I want to emphasize that like it's not extremist. It was a part of what was normal in America at the time, to practice this form of clearly racist lynching, clearly racist murder called lynching. Um, and so an important person to know is Ida B. Wells Barnett, who was a Black journalist who did tremendous work investigating lynchings across the South during her lifetime. Um, One of the most important writers of the 20th century, because of her research and her insistence to not be silent. If there's a definition of speaking truth to power, it is Ida B. Wells Barnett, who tirelessly wrote about who was lynching whom and why lynchings were happening. For her work really does so much to dispel the myth that the cause of lynching was rape, and that the idea of the black rapist was a myth that was used to justify racist killings. And so you really need to know who Ida B. Wells Barnett is. So go look up more about her on your own. Um, okay. For a literature class, I want to emphasize that the Harlem Renaissance um, is a period of fierce debate. Um, Whenever I teach an African American literature class, which again is my specialty, I always start by pointing out that African American literature is a history of debate and argument. Like there is no such thing as a homogenous idea of amongst the Black artists and writers of what Black art or writing is. Right. So I always want to disabuse students of this idea that there is such thing as like a single Black literary tradition. If there is a tradition, it is a tradition of arguing. And so the Harlem Renaissance is a moment of fierce debate over what the role of the Negro artist should be. So on the one hand, you have the idea that art is propaganda, and so a paradigmatic example of this kind of argument would be W.E.B. Du Bois's criteria for Negro art. Also, Du Bois is someone who is just an absolute intellectual giant of U.S. history, not just Black history. Du Bois is just an absolute just he lives a long life and writes so much and knows so much. You could take an entire year's worth of like 2 semesters worth of courses on just W.E.B. Du Bois's contributions to U.S. intellectual history. He's an absolute intellectual giant. But for the purpose of this lecture, I'm just going to talk about his essay Criteria for Negro Art, in which he argues that all art is propaganda, and so Black art ought to be explicit about making some kind of an argument. And for Du Bois, that was a racial uplift argument, that Black art ought to uplift the race and represent Black people at their best, at their most articulate, at their most incisive. Some people went a step further and said not only should Black art represent the race and at its best, but Black art should also always make a political argument, an explicitly political argument for some kind of form of social justice or civil rights. Opposite of that was someone like Langston Hughes, who I'm sure you've heard of, very prominent poet from the Harlem Renaissance era, who writes an essay called The Negro Artist and the Racial Mountain, in which he says that Black artists have no obligation to think about a white audience when they are writing their their text or producing their art. So for Hughes, he says that um, uh, he's not a believer in strictly art for art's sake, which is the idea that art isn't political. That's not Hughes's position. Some people have that. Hughes's position is that Black artists should express, like just pure expression of Black folk, Black consciousness, and that can take whatever form it will, whether that's like working class or poor folks who are illiterate, or whether that's upper class, buttoned up best representations of the race according to white standards. Hughes is like, do not impose your respectability on me, right? You can think about this as a kind of anti-respectability politics. Um, and so you have Du Bois and Criteria for Negro Art saying Black art should uplift the race, and you have Hughes and the Negro Artist in the Mountain saying no, Black art should simply represent all aspects of Black life, and not care about representing like better representing or worse representing. Like there's no like nothing is off limits, nothing is taboo. And so, my first question for you for your response for this week is, as you hear me describe this debate between people within a minority group saying we should always represent ourselves at our best versus no, we do not have to capitulate to um, other people's prejudices. We should represent ourselves at our best and our worst and however we want. What are some ways that you see that kind of debate playing out today in any kind of cultural places where maybe you have some folks saying we need to present ourselves as respectable and the representations of our people should be of a certain standard versus no, we should not be trying to be respectable. We should be our whole ugly, messy selves. Because there is beauty and there is ugliness, right? And where do you see that kind of debate happening today? And so an oversimplification um, that if we had more time, we would rip apart. But a quick oversimplification: two basic kinds of Harlem Renaissance literature: propaganda literature and folk literature. Propaganda literature is aligned with that first kind of argument, where a text ought to make explicitly make an argument or aim for racial uplift. An example of this, and you'll see on the left on the slide, is James Weldon Johnson and his novel autobiography of an ex-colored man. That is a novel that is it's an explicitly anti-racist, anti-lynching novel, um, uh, and it is and it is unapologetic about um, its message. On the other hand, is folk literature, which is an expression of Negro folk, regardless of expressibility, of respectability, in the way that I just described with Langston Hughes. But another person who is probably even more on this side than Hughes is Dora Neale Hurston, who writes a novel called "Their Eyes Were Watching God," and "Their Eyes Were Watching God" is a folk novel for many reasons. One being its unflinching representation of women's sexuality and sexual agency in a way that just is a big fu to anyone that would say that's not respectable. Hurston always had a big middle finger for respectability. She did not care about what white people thought of black people. She did not care about what men thought of women's sexuality, right? So Hurston's "Their Eyes Are Watching God" has content in it that is very much like would be taboo for someone like Du Bois. But also, "Their Eyes Are Watching God" is written entirely in Southern Black dialect. The language is not quote unquote proper English. It is written in dialect. And so some folks would say, like other Black people who are against Hurston's way of writing would say that you're making us seem illiterate. Um, Hurston is like, no, this is what we actually said. And in my personal opinion, "Their Eyes Are Watching God" is one of the 3 to 5 most aesthetically gorgeous novels I have ever read in the English language. If you ever have the opportunity to read the novel, it's too long for me to teach in this class, but you should absolutely read it. It is a beautiful, gorgeous novel. Um, so that's I just wanted to say that. But so those are two examples of like a binary of like what kinds of literature there are in the Harlem Renaissance. Regardless of those two different kinds of literature and all the arguments that are happening, the common theme is the new Negro. While the Harlem Renaissance was a period of fierce debate over the purpose and aim of Black art, there was consensus around the very general idea that something was new in African American art and life. So whether you had folks like Hurston and Hughes who didn't give a damn about respectability and who were going to write whatever they wanted to write, or you had folks like Alan Locke or W.E. Du Bois or James Weldon Johnson, who are like, no, we should craft our art carefully to make an argument for the uplift of Black people within this racist country. Everyone was saying the Black people of today are not the Black people of 50 years ago. The Harlem Renaissance was aimed at creating this new Negro, this modern kind of sensibility and really innovative aesthetics. And I have here just to give you a quick taste of the fact that visual art is so important to the Harlem Renaissance. Three very famous, very significant visual artists. On the left, Aaron Douglas. In the middle, Jacob Lawrence, and on the right, Laura Wheeler Waring. And you can go out and look up more information about them on your own. Okay, and then our last slide for today's lecture is introducing this week's specific reading, which is Angelina Weld Grimke's play, Rachel. So Rachel is a play that blends melodrama and realism. So building on last week's lecture where I explained how realism and naturalism were rejections of the melodrama of the 19th century, Rachel is a play that utilizes both realism in its depiction of Black domestic life and the stresses of living in the context and aftermath of lynching, alongside kind of more melodramatic artistic techniques like Rachel's dramatic monologues and the emotive pathos of the stage directions. Again, don't skip stage directions. Also, remember from the play last week, Trifles, that what happens off stage is just as important as what happens on stage. So think about that while you're reading Rachel. I also want to signal that Rachel is part of a whole genre called lynching plays. Because lynching was this predominant terror that is part of the context of the Harlem Renaissance. It influences a lot of different forms of literature during the Harlem Renaissance. And one of the most prominent forms of literature that addresses lynching actually winds up being plays. I would argue, and some scholars besides me would argue, even more so than novels. That for some reason, which again, beyond the scope of this particular 200 level course, plays become a particularly useful form for African American writers to address lynching. So Rachel is an interesting play in that it is a lynching play where the lynching never actually happens on stage. So the actual lynching in this play is actually always talked about, but it's never on stage, and that's important. And the last thing I'll say about this play for you as readers is pay really close, special attention to different kinds of monologue. And so this is kind of like where the teacher gives you vocabulary words for the week. Your two vocabulary words for different kinds of monologue in dramatic literature are soliloquy and apostrophe. Soliloquy is a monologue where a character speaks from off of their own consciousness and is not addressing any audience in particular. It is just someone talking by themselves on a stage. So that is usually more obvious. The other form of monologue, this is still a monologue where it's just one character talking themselves, right? Again, backing up monologue, one character by themselves, dialogue, characters talking to each other, right? So soliloquy and apostrophe are both monologue. Soliloquy, a monologue where the character is just talking to themselves or by themselves. Apostrophe is a particular form of monologue where the character is addressing someone or something that is either absent or inanimate. So, an example from pop culture that I can think of off the top of my head would be Avatar: The Last Airbender. There's a scene where Zuko is shouting in a lightning storm, "Strike me down, strike me, lightning!" Right? When Zuko is yelling at the lightning, lightning cannot hear him. It's an inanimate object or inanimate force. So when Zuko's addressing lightning, that is an example of apostrophe. He is addressing something that can't actually hear him. In literature, in Herman Melville's novel Moby Dick, the Captain Ahab has a very famous apostrophe to the sun. So addressing something like lightning or the sun or God, right? Like these beings or forces that aren't actually present or can't actually hear and respond. That would be an example of apostrophe. Apostrophe could also be addressing someone who's absent, an audience that's not actually there to hear you. And so in Rachel, it's a 3-act play. Every single act of Rachel ends with the titular character Rachel giving a monologue. Sometimes that monologue is soliloquy, and sometimes it is apostrophe. And you need to pay close attention to what she's saying and what the stage directors are saying so you can keep track of whether it is a soliloquy or apostrophe, because that affects how you play and how you interpret what's happening. Okay, yeah, so that's without spoiling the plot, I'm just telling you that that's important and you should pay attention to it. So, um, my, you know what? That's it. I'm not going to add a second. I'm not going to add a second question today. This is a long lecture. I gave you a question a couple slides earlier to respond to in your lecture response for the week. There's going to be no additional lecture response question here at the end of the lecture. I'm just gonna kind of stop it there. So that's your lecture on the Harlem Renaissance. It's a lot of information. I know this is the longest one of the semester so far. Um, but hopefully it helps contextualize what's going on in this play for this week and what's going to be going on in the couple of poems that you're going to read next week as well.